Adeline Marsh, Assistant State Attorney. The words landed in that little police station like a dropped glass. Deputy Wes Colton stopped breathing. He looked at the gray-haired man standing in his doorway, then at the girl in the holding cell, the girl in the hoodie, the one he had called a freshman, the one whose bag he had thrown on a diner floor 2 nights ago, laughing while he did it. "Unless you'd like to add kidnapping to whatever charges you're currently fabricating," the old man said quietly, "I suggest you open that cell, right now." Colton's hands started shaking, because he finally understood something. That quiet young woman had not been scared of him, not for one single second. She had been counting, watching, remembering every rule he broke, and she had a hearing to get to in 19 minutes. Stay with me, because this town buried a good man's name 20 years ago. Today, it was coming back.
There is a kind of silence that scares people more than shouting ever could. You will meet a young woman tonight who understood that better than most. She was 24 years old. She looked like any tired college kid you might see at midnight, hunched over a laptop, chewing the end of a pen. But looks, as you are about to learn, can be the most dangerous lie in the world. This is the story of a girl the town of Millbrook thought they understood, and a badge that thought it knew exactly who it was dealing with. Both of them were wrong. Stay with me, because what happened over the next 48 hours would tear open a wound this town had been hiding for 20 years. Maybe you have lived long enough to know a truth like this one already, that the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest one. That real strength usually looks like patience, like a person who waits and watches and says very little until the moment finally comes when their words actually matter. If you know that truth already, you are going to enjoy tonight's story more than most. If you do not know it yet, you are about to learn it right alongside a small town that had no idea what was walking through its front door. And it all started at a diner on a wet Wednesday night with a cup of coffee that went cold before anyone got to drink it. Grab your own coffee, or your tea, or whatever you are having tonight. Settle in. This one takes a little while to tell properly, and it deserves to be told properly. Some stories rush toward the ending. This is not that kind of story. This is the kind that unfolds slowly, the way real life usually does, one quiet decision at a time, until you look up and realize everything has changed. Millbrook is the kind of town you drive through without noticing. One traffic light, a grain silo on the edge of town, a church with a steeple that leans just slightly to the left, and nobody quite remembers why. Population just under 3,000, according to the sign at the edge of town, though most folks agreed that number had not been updated in a very long time. The younger families kept leaving for the cities, one by one, chasing jobs that no longer existed in a place this small. The ones who stayed did so out of loyalty or stubbornness, or simply because leaving never felt like the right kind of brave. If you blink on the highway, you miss it entirely. But if you slow down, if you actually stop, you will find Fenwick's Diner sitting right off Route 9, its neon sign buzzing like it has for 40 years. Named after the woman who has run it since before most of the regulars were born, Opal Fenwick was 71 years old that spring. Silver hair pulled back, hands that had flipped more pancakes than she could count. She had seen every kind of person walk through that door. Truckers, runaways, old farmers who came in just for the company. She kept a little notebook behind the register once, years ago. She wrote down the regulars' orders so she would never forget them. Black coffee, no sugar for the retired mailman who came in every Tuesday. Extra crispy bacon for the widow who lived 2 blocks over and never once said why she needed the crunch so badly. She had stopped writing them down eventually. She did not need the notebook anymore. She simply knew. That is what happens when you run the same diner for 4 decades. The town stops being a collection of strangers. It becomes a family you did not exactly choose but grew to love anyway, mess and all. She thought she had seen every kind of person life could send through that door. She had not. It was just past 11 at night when the bell above the door gave its little jingle. A young woman stepped inside, shaking rain off a gray hooded sweatshirt. She was slim, maybe 5'5". Dark blonde hair pulled into a messy bun that had mostly come undone. She carried an old leather satchel worn soft at the corners, the kind of bag that had clearly been carried for years, not months. She slid into a booth near the back, the one under the flickering light that Opal kept meaning to fix. She ordered black coffee, nothing else. Then she pulled out a laptop and started typing. If you had walked past that booth, you would have thought exactly one thing. College kid, probably from Millbrook State, probably cramming for a test she should have studied for last week. That is exactly what Opal thought, too. "Long night, honey?" Opal asked, setting down the coffee. The young woman looked up. Her eyes were tired but sharp, very sharp. "Something like that," she said, and she smiled, a small, polite smile, the kind that does not invite more questions. Opal let it go. She had learned a long time ago. Some people need quiet more than they need conversation. 2 booths over, an elderly man in a faded flannel shirt looked up briefly from his own plate of eggs, studied the young stranger for a moment, then went back to his breakfast, unbothered. He had lived in Millbrook his whole life, same as most everyone in the diner that night. He had learned decades ago that a stranger passing through was rarely worth much curiosity. People came and went, the town stayed the same, either way. He had no idea, of course, how wrong that particular assumption would turn out to be. She had no idea how right that instinct was. Because the young woman was not cramming for a test, she was reading through pages and pages of complaint filings, public records, old newspaper clippings scanned and saved on her hard drive. Every single one of them had the same word buried somewhere inside: Millbrook. Her name was Adeline Marsh. Everyone who knew her called her Addie, and Addie Marsh was not a freshman. She was 24 years old, yes. She did look young for her age, yes, but 3 years earlier, Addie Marsh had graduated law school near the top of her class, and for the last year and a half she had worked as an assistant state attorney. She had always moved fast through school, faster than most. An accelerated undergraduate program finished in 3 years instead of 4, a relentless pace through law school that left little time for much else. People who knew her well understood why. She was not chasing a resume, she was chasing time itself, trying to close the distance between herself and a debt she had been carrying since she was old enough to understand what her father had lost. Her job was not glamorous. It was not the kind of thing you see on television, with big speeches and dramatic gavel slams. Her job was patience, paperwork, following patterns that most people never noticed. Her office handled cases of misconduct, cases where the people meant to protect a community had instead abused their power over it. Small towns, mostly. Towns too small to have their own oversight board. Towns where one bad officer could operate for years, protected by silence, protected by nobody wanting to make trouble. She had not chosen this kind of law by accident. Growing up, she had watched a good man lose everything he had built simply because nobody with power wanted to ask an uncomfortable question at the right time. She had been young when it happened, too young to understand the details, old enough to understand the silence that followed. That silence had shaped her more than any classroom ever could. She went to law school not to win big cases or make headlines, but because somewhere along the way she had decided that silence was the real enemy. Not cruelty, exactly. Cruelty announces itself. Silence just lets cruelty keep going. Her colleagues sometimes teased her gently for choosing the slow, unglamorous cases. Small towns instead of big corporations. Quiet misconduct instead of front-page scandal. She never minded the teasing. She understood something they did not always seem to. The people hurt worst by quiet corruption are almost always the quiet people themselves. The ones with no lawyer on speed dial, the ones nobody thinks to believe. She had made it her job to believe them anyway, and then to prove it. Millbrook had shown up on her desk 3 months earlier. 4 separate complaints filed over 2 years, all against the same deputy. All of them dismissed. All of them buried before they ever reached a judge. On paper, that deputy looked spotless, which in Addie's experience was exactly the kind of thing that should make you nervous. She could have handled this the easy way. She could have shown up in a blazer, flashed a badge, asked polite questions that everyone would have polished their answers for. But polished answers do not tell the truth. She needed to see with her own eyes how this town actually treated someone with no name, no title, and no one obviously watching. So she came as nobody, just a girl in a hoodie, sitting in a diner booth, waiting. She did not know exactly what would happen that night. She only knew deep down that if this deputy was the man she suspected, he would not be able to help himself. Some men only show you who they really are when they think no one important is looking. The bell above the door jingled again at 11:40. This time it was not rain that came in with the cold air. It was Deputy Wes Colton, 34 years old. Built like he still played high school football and never quite let it go. Buzzed hair under his cap, a walk that took up more space than it needed to. He was not on an emergency call. He was not chasing anyone. He was simply doing what he did most nights around this time. Walking into Fenwick's for a free refill and a little bit of attention. Colton had grown up in Millbrook, same as most of the department. His father had driven the county snowplow for 30 years. A steady, unremarkable job that never once made anyone in town nod with respect the way a badge did. Wes had wanted that respect since he was a kid. He wanted people to straighten up a little when he walked into a room. He wanted the kind of attention his father never got, plowing snow at 4 in the morning while everyone else stayed warm in bed. He had gotten it more or less the day he pinned on his badge. People did straighten up around him now. They did watch their words. What nobody had ever quite taught him was the difference between respect and fear. He had never really learned to tell them apart. And in a town this small, with almost no one watching closely enough to correct him, that confusion had been allowed to grow quietly for years. "Evening, Opal," he said, tipping his hat like he was in an old western. "Evening, Wes," Opal answered, already reaching for the coffee pot. Some habits in a small town run deeper than affection. Colton's eyes swept the diner, the way they always did, half boredom, half performance. They landed on the booth in the back, on the girl with the messy bun, the laptop, the old leather bag. Something in him perked up. Not concern, not real suspicion, something closer to interest. The kind of interest a man gets when he sees someone he thinks he can push around a little just to feel bigger for a minute. "Who's that?" he asked Opal, voice low but not low enough. Opal followed his gaze. "Just a girl, studying. Leave her be, Wes." "Just checking," he said, but he did not sit down at the counter like usual. Instead, he walked straight toward the back booth. Addie heard the boots before she saw him. Heavy steps, deliberate. She kept her eyes on her screen for one more second, just long enough to close the file she had been reading. Then she looked up, polite and neutral, the way you look at any stranger who approaches your table. "Evening," Colton said. "Mind if I ask what you're doing out here so late?" "Studying," Addie said simply. "Studying what?" "Just some reading." He glanced at the laptop screen, now dark, at the leather satchel resting against her leg. "You a student, Millbrook State?" Addie paused for half a second, just half a second. "Something like that," she said again, the same small answer she had given Opal. It was true in its own strange way. She had studied, she still studied, every single day, just not the way he assumed. But Colton did not hear nuance. He heard exactly what he expected to hear, confirmation. "ID," he said, not a request, an order dressed up in one word. Addie did not flinch. She did not argue. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her driver's license, just her license, nothing more. She could have shown him everything right then, the badge in her bag, the letter with the state seal, the card that would have made him stand up straighter and start apologizing. She did not. Because if she showed him that card, she would learn nothing tonight except how a man behaves when he is afraid of consequences. She wanted to know how he behaved when he thought there weren't any. Colton studied the license like it owed him money. "Adeline Marsh," he read aloud, slower than necessary. "That's a mouthful." "People call me Addie." "Uh-huh." He handed it back, but he did not step away. "We had a report earlier tonight," he said. "Wallet went missing over at the gas station on 5th. Young woman, dark clothes, kind of your build." It was, Addie would learn much later, a report that barely existed. A man had misplaced his own wallet in his truck and found it 20 minutes after calling it in. Nobody had bothered updating the log. But Colton had heard "young woman" and "gas station" over the radio hours ago, and something in his brain had simply stapled it to the first stranger he found sitting alone at night. "I haven't been near a gas station," Addie said calmly. "I've been sitting right here for almost an hour. Ask Opal." Opal, who had drifted closer without quite meaning to, spoke up immediately. "She's telling the truth, Wes. She's been here the whole time." Colton did not look at Opal. He kept his eyes on Addie. "I'm going to need you to stand up," he said. "Just for a minute. Routine." There is a particular moment in any story like this where the entire shape of the night changes. This was that moment. Addie could feel it settle over the diner like a held breath. She thought about her father, about the story she had heard 100 times growing up about a badge and a lie and a silence that lasted 20 years. She thought about every complaint file sitting on her laptop and how many of them started with a sentence just like this one. Routine. She stood up slowly, hands visible, voice steady. "Am I being detained?" she asked. It was such a simple question. Any first-year law student could have asked it. But something about the way she asked it, calm and precise, made Colton's jaw tighten. "You're being cooperative," he said. "That's what you're being. Unless you got a problem with that." "No problem," Addie said. "I just like to understand what's happening to me." What happened next took less than 90 seconds. Colton told her to turn around. She did. He told her hands behind her back. She complied without a single word of protest. The cuffs clicked shut, cold, and a little too tight. And then, almost as an afterthought, he reached down and grabbed the leather satchel off the floor. "This yours?" he asked, though he was already unzipping it before she could answer. "Yes," Addie said. "And I'd appreciate you not going through it without cause." Colton laughed. Not cruelly, exactly. Just careless. The laugh of a man who has never once had to think about what it feels like to be searched. "Relax," he said. "Just checking for anything sharp." He rifled through it quickly. A notebook, a phone charger, a folder of papers he did not bother reading, the top one folded over so only half a header showed. He did not care what it said. He tossed the whole bag back down, not onto the booth seat, but onto the floor. It landed with a soft thud. A pen rolled out and disappeared under the next table. "Hey now," Opal said, sharper this time. "There's no call for that, Wes. Pick that bag up proper." Colton did not pick it up. "Ma'am, I need you to stay out of official business," he said, not even looking at her. Opal's mouth pressed into a thin line. In her 71 years, she had learned exactly when arguing made things worse for someone she was trying to protect. This was one of those times. So she stayed quiet, but she did not look away. And she watched Addie's face very closely, because something about it, something about the set of her jaw and the calm in her eyes, tugged at a memory Opal could not quite place. Not yet. Colton walked Addie toward the door, one hand on her arm, guiding her like she might bolt. She would not have bolted. Running was the last thing on her mind. As they passed the counter, Addie glanced, just once, at the little bag on the floor. She thought about the folder inside it, the one with her badge card tucked between 2 pages, half hidden. He had held it in his hands. He had not even looked. That detail, small as it seemed, told her more about this man than an hour of interrogation ever could. Some people are careless because they are lazy. Some people are careless because they have never once been made to answer for the damage careless causes. She suspected strongly that Deputy Wes Colton fell into the second category. There is a lesson in that, if you are willing to hear it. The way a person treats something they think has no value tells you everything about how they will treat a person they think has no value too. A bag tossed on the floor is a small thing. A life tossed aside again and again because nobody with power ever stopped to look closely is not a small thing at all. Addie had read that lesson in 100 case files over the last year and a half. Tonight, she was living it instead of reading it. There is a difference. A big one. Paper never flinches when you touch it. People do. Outside, the rain had softened to a light drizzle. The patrol car sat under the one working street lamp on Route 9, its light bar dark, engine idling. Colton opened the back door and guided her head down with one hand, the way officers are trained to do. Before she folded into the seat, Addie's eyes flicked upward, quick and quiet, to the small camera mounted on the dashboard. The light on it was off. No red blink, no recording indicator. She filed that detail away too, carefully, the way you fold a piece of paper and slide it into your pocket for later. Some details do not matter in the moment. They matter enormously later, when someone finally asks the right question. The drive to the station took 11 minutes. Addie counted them quietly, the way she counted most things now. It was a habit from the job. Numbers do not lie even when people do. Colton did not speak much on the drive. He hummed along to the radio some country song about a truck and a girl who got away, tapping 2 fingers against the steering wheel like the whole night was nothing more than a mildly amusing errand. Addie watched the town slide past through the rain-streaked window. A shuttered hardware store, a church with a leaning steeple, a billboard for a lawyer 2 counties over promising to fight for you. The paint on it faded almost past reading. She thought not for the first time how strange it was that towns like this one so rarely had anyone close by who could actually help when help was needed. The nearest real courthouse was 45 minutes away. The nearest independent newspaper had closed 9 years earlier. People here mostly had to trust that the people wearing the badge were doing right by them because there was rarely anyone else around to check. That, she understood, was exactly how quiet corruption survived best. Not in big cities with cameras on every corner. In small, forgotten places where trust was the only oversight anyone had left. Opal stood in the doorway of her diner, arms crossed against the cold, watching the taillights disappear down Route 9. She had lived in Millbrook her whole life. She had watched this town grow small businesses and lose them. She had watched 3 different mayors come and go, promising the same things each time. And more than once over the years, she had watched a badge get worn by the wrong kind of man. She thought of one man in particular, a man from a long time ago. A man whose photograph still sat in a drawer behind her register, wrapped in an old dish towel because she had never been able to bring herself to throw it away, and never quite found the courage to hang it back up either. She did not know why that girl's face brought him to mind so strongly tonight, but it did, and that unsettled her more than the arrest itself. She went back inside, turned the sign on the door from open to closed 20 minutes earlier than usual, and sat down at the counter alone. For a long while, she just stared at the leftover coffee cup on the back booth table, still half full, gone cold. She thought about how easy it is in a small town to let silence become a habit. You tell yourself it is not your business. You tell yourself somebody else will speak up, somebody with less to lose. You tell yourself that one quiet Wednesday night does not matter much in the grand scheme of things. She had told herself exactly that 20 years ago, and she had lived with the weight of it every single day since. Opal climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment above the diner, the same stairs she had climbed 10,000 times before, and she sat down on the edge of her bed without turning on the light. Somewhere in a drawer downstairs, wrapped in an old dish towel, was a photograph of a man in uniform, smiling the easy smile of someone who had not yet learned what this town was capable of doing to a good man's name. She had not looked at that photograph in years. She did not need to look at it tonight to see his face. It was, she realized with a small cold jolt, very nearly the same face she had just watched get led out of her diner in handcuffs. Same steady eyes. Same quiet stubbornness in the set of the jaw. She told herself it was a coincidence. Small towns are full of resemblances that mean nothing at all. But some nights in a small town, everybody feels the shift in the air before they understand why. This was one of those nights for Opal Fenwick. The Millbrook police station was not much to look at. A squat brick building with 2 patrol cars parked out front and a flag that badly needed replacing. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed the same way the diner sign buzzed. Small towns, it seems, share more habits than their people realize. Colton walked Addie through the booking process himself. He was, to put it gently, not thorough. He wrote her name down wrong the first time, then crossed it out with a single line instead of starting a new form. He read her rights off a laminated card, mumbling through it so fast that half the words blurred together. He never once asked if she understood what he had just said. He filled out the incident report standing up, balancing the clipboard against his hip, writing and handwriting so rushed it barely counted as letters. Under reason for detainment, he wrote 3 words, matches description, nothing more. He did not write down the time. He did not write down that the alleged victim of the wallet theft had never actually been asked to confirm the description in the first place. He did not write down that his dash cam had not been running. Small omissions. The kind that looked like nothing on their own. But Addie had spent enough late nights at the office to know exactly how small omissions grow over months and years into something much larger. A missing timestamp here, an unchecked box there. Enough of them stacked, one on top of another, and eventually you have a system that protects itself instead of the people it was built to serve. She watched him write, and she said nothing. Not yet. Some evidence is best collected simply by watching it happen. He never once asked if she wanted to make a phone call until she asked him herself. I'm entitled to 1 call, Addie said. Calm, not pleading, simply stating a fact the way she might state the weather. Colton looked at her for a long moment like he was deciding whether the rule actually applied to someone like her. Fine, he said finally. 1 call, make it quick. He set an old desk phone in front of her, the cord stretched and tangled from years of use. Who you even gonna call? He asked, leaning against the counter with his arms folded. Mommy and Daddy come bail out the little freshman? He said freshman with a small smirk, like the word itself was a joke he was enjoying. Addie did not answer him directly. She simply picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory, a number she had called perhaps 100 times over the past year and a half. It rang twice before going to voicemail. You've reached the after-hours line for the state attorney's office, the recording said. If this is an emergency, please leave a detailed message. Addie waited for the beep. This is case flag Marsh Millbrook, she said, voice low and even. I need someone to check the status log first thing in the morning. No further detail tonight, just flag it as active. She hung up. Colton had been listening, arms still crossed, expression unreadable. Case flag, he repeated slowly. The hell is that supposed to mean? It means exactly what I said, Addie replied. A flag, on a case. What case? Addie looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time since the diner, not with anger, not with fear, with something closer to patience. The kind of patience a teacher has for a student who is about to learn a very hard lesson sooner than he thinks. You'll find out, she said quietly. Everybody does, eventually. Colton did not like that answer. Men like him rarely like answers they cannot immediately control. He led her toward the holding cell at the back of the station, a small room with a single bench bolted to the wall, a metal toilet in the corner, and a barred door that clanged shut with a sound that echoes longer than it should. Before he closed it, he tossed the leather satchel onto the bench beside her, the same rough toss as before. You can keep your bag, he said. Not like there's anything interesting in it anyway. He turned to walk away. Deputy Colton, Addie said. He stopped, surprised she remembered his name from the badge on his chest, or perhaps surprised she used it at all. Your dash cam wasn't recording tonight, she said. You might want to note that in your report. Departments tend to ask about things like that. For just a second, something flickered across his face. Not quite worry, more like the shadow before worry arrives. Then he laughed it off. You watch too many cop shows, kid, he said, and walked back to his desk. Addie sat down on the metal bench, pulled her knees up slightly, and rested her back against the cold concrete wall. She was tired. She was cold. Her wrists aged faintly from the cuffs, though they had removed those once she was inside the cell. But underneath all of that, something in her felt oddly still, calm. Because she had come to Millbrook looking for exactly this, A man who would show his true face when he thought nobody with any power was watching. He had shown it to her in under 2 hours. She reached over and pulled her satchel closer, unzipping it slowly. Inside, tucked beneath the notebook and the folder, was a small leather wallet. She opened it. Her identification card looked back up at her in the dim light. State seal. Her photograph taken 18 months earlier, looking impossibly young in a blazer that had felt too big at the time. Assistant State Attorney Adeline Marsh. She traced her thumb over the edge of the card the way she sometimes did when she needed to remember exactly who she was and why she had chosen this life. Her father had told her once, years ago, sitting on the porch of their house with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them, that the law only works if somebody is willing to stand quietly in the wrong place at the wrong time and simply watch. Most folks, he had said, run from trouble. The good ones learn to walk straight into it, carefully, patiently, and they remember every single detail because one day those details are the only thing standing between a lie and the truth. She had been 16 when he told her that. She had not fully understood it until tonight. She closed the wallet, slid it back into the satchel, and closed her eyes. Not to sleep, just to think. Somewhere outside these walls, a lie had been living comfortably in Millbrook for a very long time. Tonight, without meaning to, Deputy Wes Colton had just handed her the first thread of it. Across town, in a small house with peeling white paint and a porch light that had been left on for reasons nobody quite remembered anymore, an old man sat awake in his recliner. Walter Marsh was 68 years old. His hands, once steady enough to hold a service weapon without a tremor, now shook slightly when he poured his evening tea. 20 years ago, Walter had worn a badge in a town not far from here. A good badge, worn honestly for a long time. Until one report, one false accusation planted just carefully enough to look real. Until a silence from the very people who were supposed to have his back. Until the day he handed in that badge, packed up his desk into a single cardboard box, and drove away from a life he had built for 22 years. He rarely spoke about it anymore, not even to Addie most days. But he thought about it every single time he saw a young officer in uniform. Every single time. Tonight, for reasons he could not explain, he had not been able to sleep. He kept glancing at his phone sitting silent on the side table. He did not know, not yet, that his daughter was sitting in a jail cell 40 minutes away. He did not know that the town she had gone to investigate was the very town whose name still gave him nightmares 2 decades later. He only knew in the quiet, stubborn way that old instincts refused to fully go away that something felt wrong tonight. Walter had raised Addie from the time she was 7 years old, after her own parents passed in a car accident on a rainy stretch of interstate not far from here. He had never planned on raising a child alone. Life rarely asks permission before it changes your plans. But he remembered the first night she came to live with him, small and quiet and frightened, sitting on the edge of a bed in a room that still smelled like fresh paint. He remembered promising her, without quite knowing how he would keep the promise, that he would never let anyone lie about her the way people had once lied about him. He had not talked about his own badge in years. Not because the wound had healed. Wounds like that rarely heal all the way. He had simply learned to carry it quietly, the way you carry an old injury that aches only when the weather turns. Tonight, for reasons he could not name, that old ache had returned in full. So he sat in his recliner, tea going cold in his hands, and he waited. Sometimes in life, that is the only thing love knows how to do in the dark. Wait, and trust that morning will bring answers. Back at the station, the night crawled forward slowly. Colton finished his paperwork with the same careless speed he did everything else, then leaned back in his chair, feet up on the desk, scrolling through his phone. Around 1 in the morning, another officer wandered in from patrol, shaking rain off his jacket. A younger deputy named Grant, quieter, newer to the force, still eager enough to believe the job was mostly about helping people. He glanced toward the holding cell. "Who's that?" he asked. "Some girl from the diner," Colton said, not looking up from his phone. "Thought she matched a report." "She do it?" Colton shrugged. "Don't matter much tonight. She's not getting processed till morning anyway. Let her sit and think about it. Grant frowned slightly. He walked closer to the cell, peering through the bars. Addie was sitting quietly, eyes closed, breathing slow and even. Not asleep, just still. She could probably make bail tonight if we processed her now, Grant said.
Seems kind of harsh keeping her overnight for something that unclear.
You worry about your own paperwork, Colton said, an edge creeping into his voice. I got this handled. Grant hesitated. He was young enough to still feel that small itch of doubt in his stomach, the one that tells you something is not being done the way it should. He had joined the department 8 months earlier, fresh out of the academy, still carrying the kind of idealism that had not yet been worn smooth by long nights and short paychecks. He believed mostly that the badge meant something, that it was a promise, not just a piece of metal. He had heard things about Colton before tonight, small things. A complaint that got quietly dropped. A traffic stop that went longer than it should have for reasons nobody wrote down clearly. He had never seen anything himself, not directly, and in a town this small, you learn quickly that repeating rumors can cost you a career before it even starts. So, he had kept his head down. He had told himself that was the smart thing to do. Standing there now, looking through the bars at a young woman sitting so calmly in that cold cell, something in him did not feel smart at all. It felt small, cowardly even, though he would not have used that word out loud. He was also new enough and cautious enough not to push it further that night. He went back to his own desk, but he glanced toward that cell one more time before he sat down. Some people, even when they say nothing, remember exactly what they saw. That would matter later, more than Grant could possibly have guessed that night. Inside the cell, Addie opened her eyes. She had heard every word of that exchange. The walls in a station this old carried sound easily. She noted quietly that not every officer in this building was cut from the same cloth as Colton. That, too, was useful information. Corruption rarely infects an entire building evenly. There are always cracks, always someone uncomfortable even if they do not yet know what to do with that discomfort. She thought about her father again, about patience. She thought about every case file she had studied for 3 months, every timeline of complaints filed and quietly dismissed. And she thought with a small, tired smile about the word Colton had used earlier. Freshman. He thought she was a scared kid with nobody watching, nobody who would ever hold him accountable. He had no idea that somewhere on a desk in the state attorney's office a folder with the word Millbrook printed across the top had been sitting open for 3 months, waiting exactly for a night like this one. He had no idea that the woman in his holding cell had chosen deliberately to let herself be treated exactly the way this town's most vulnerable people had been treated for years. Not because she wanted sympathy, because she wanted proof. The kind of proof that cannot be argued away in a hearing room. The kind that comes from living through it, not just reading about it. There is an old lesson, one you have probably heard from a grandparent or a preacher, or maybe just learned the hard way yourself. Dignity is not something other people give you. It is something you carry quietly, no matter how they treat you. Addie had believed that lesson her whole life. Tonight, sitting in a cold cell with her wrists still faintly aching, she believed it more than ever. Colton could take her freedom for a few hours. He could toss her bag on the floor and mock the word freshman like it was an insult instead of simply a wrong guess. He could not touch the one thing that actually mattered. Who she was underneath all of it remained exactly the same whether he recognized it or not. That, she thought, was the real difference between people who abuse power and people who are simply trying to survive a hard night. Power convinces itself it can define a person. It never actually can. She leaned her head back against the cold wall. "You picked the wrong person to underestimate tonight, Deputy Colton," she whispered so quietly the words barely stirred the air. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. A thin, gray light was still hours away from touching the horizon, but something in Millbrook had already begun to shift the way weather shifts before a storm anyone can see coming. Not everyone in that building understood it yet. Not Colton, still scrolling carelessly on his phone. Not young Grant, sitting quietly at his desk with an uneasy feeling he could not name. Not even Opal, lying awake in her small apartment above the diner, staring at the ceiling, trying to place a face she had not seen this clearly in 20 years. But somewhere deep in the bones of this town, an old debt was finally, quietly coming due. And by morning, the first crack in that silence would begin to show. That is where we leave things for now. A young woman sitting calmly in a cold cell holding a truth this town was not ready for. An old man across town waiting for a phone call he did not yet know he would receive. And a deputy who thought the night was over when really it had only just begun. Somewhere out on Route 9, the street lamp above the empty diner parking lot flickered once, then steadied, casting its thin yellow light over wet pavement and nothing else. Millbrook slept on, unaware. Most towns do, right before something changes them for good. Nobody rings a bell to announce it. Nobody feels a shiver down their spine at exactly the right moment. Life simply keeps moving ordinary and quiet until one morning it does not anymore. If you have lived long enough, you already know this rhythm. You have felt it before in your own life. The quiet night before the phone call that changed everything. The ordinary Tuesday before the diagnosis or the job offer or the knock on the door you never expected. Change rarely announces itself in advance. It simply arrives and asks you quietly whether you are the kind of person who looks away or the kind who finally speaks up. Millbrook was about to find out which kind of town it truly was. Maybe that is worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. Every town, every family, every one of us really gets tested eventually. Not by anything dramatic most of the time, just by an ordinary night, an ordinary decision, an ordinary chance to speak up or stay silent. What you do with that ordinary moment says more about you than almost anything else ever will. In part 2, you will learn exactly what Opal remembered that night. You will learn the truth about a badge lost 20 years ago. And you will watch a town start to realize that the girl they dismissed as just another freshman was never who they thought she was. Stay with me for that, because sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones carrying the loudest truth. And sometimes justice does not arrive with sirens and shouting. Sometimes it arrives wearing an old leather satchel, sitting patiently in a jail cell, simply waiting for the right moment to speak. Morning in Millbrook does not arrive all at once. It comes in pieces. A rooster 2 streets over, a garbage truck grinding its way down Main Street, the smell of bacon drifting out of one kitchen window, then another. By 7 o'clock, the town looked exactly like it always did, ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of place where nothing much ever seems to happen. People here have a particular way of trusting each other. They leave doors unlocked. They wave at cars they do not recognize because, in a town this size, strangers are rare enough to deserve a friendly nod. That kind of trust is a beautiful thing, when it is earned. It is also, if you are not careful, exactly the kind of soil where quiet corruption grows best. Nobody thinks to check on the people they already trust completely. Millbrook had elected the same handful of officials for years, sometimes running unopposed simply because nobody else wanted the job. The county newspaper had folded a decade earlier, and with it went the last regular set of outside eyes anyone in this town had ever really had. People here did not distrust their local government out of any particular grievance. They simply had no habit of questioning it at all. That, too, is a kind of danger quieter than most and far harder to see coming. But inside a small brick building with a flag that needed replacing, something had already begun to shift. A young woman named Adeline Marsh had spent the night sitting in a jail cell wrongly accused, quietly, patient, waiting for the town to show her exactly who it really was. By the time the sun came up, it had already started to. Addie woke, if you could call it waking, from a thin, uneasy rest that never quite became real sleep. Her back ached from the metal bench. Her neck felt stiff from leaning against concrete for hours. She sat up slowly, rolled her shoulders, and looked around the small holding cell in the gray morning light. Nothing had changed. Same bars, same cold floor, same leather satchel sitting beside her, its contents undisturbed since Colton had tossed it there the night before. She checked her watch. 6:52 in the morning. By her own careful math, she had a little over a day before the state oversight hearing in the Capitol, the one that would decide once and for all whether the complaints against this department finally got the attention they deserved. Not much time, but enough if she used it well. She had learned a long time ago that time pressure does one of two things to people. It makes careless people even more careless, or it makes careful people even more careful. She intended to be the second kind. She thought briefly about all the mornings she had woken up in her small apartment back in the Capitol coffee maker, humming sunlight through clean curtains, nothing more urgent on her mind than which case file to open first. She did not resent this cold cell for taking that comfort away, not really. She had chosen this. Nobody had forced her to sit in a diner booth last night, waiting to be noticed by exactly the wrong kind of man. But choosing hardship on purpose does not make it painless. It only makes it purposeful. There is a difference, and she had learned to hold on to that difference tightly, especially on mornings like this one, when her body ached and her patience wore thin. She stood stretched carefully and ran her fingers once through her tangled hair, trying to make herself look, at the very least, like a person who had not spent the night on a metal bench. It did not entirely work. It would have to be enough anyway. Deputy Grant Holloway arrived for his shift at 7, hair still damp from a quick shower, a thermos of coffee in one hand. He had not slept well either. He kept thinking about the young woman in the cell and the uneasy feeling that had followed him home the night before. Grant lived alone in a small rental 2 blocks from the station, the kind of place with thin walls and a landlord who never quite fixed the heat properly. He had grown up 1 county over, the son of a school teacher and a man who worked the line at a meatpacking plant until his knees gave out. Nobody in his family had ever worn a badge before him. He had chosen this career for reasons that sounded almost embarrassing when he tried to explain them out loud. He wanted to be the kind of person people could trust without having to think twice about it. 8 months in that vision of himself had started to feel further away than he expected. Not because the job itself was wrong, but because the men he worked alongside did not always seem to share the same vision he carried. He nodded at the night shift officer on his way out, then walked past the holding cell on his way to his desk the way he did every morning. This time, he stopped. "Morning," he said, a little awkwardly, unsure whether talking to someone in custody was even allowed. Addie looked up. "Morning. You doing okay in there?" It was a simple question, small, the kind of thing a decent person asks without thinking twice. But something about it landed differently on Addie. Most people who worked in that building had not bothered to ask her anything all night except questions meant to trap her into a confession she had no reason to give. "I'm managing," she said. "Thank you for asking." Grant nodded, shifted his weight, seemed like he wanted to say more, then thought better of it. "Colton's not in till 9, he said instead. "If you need anything before then, water, whatever, just holler." He walked away before she could answer, like he had already said more than he meant to. Addie watched him go. She filed that detail away too carefully, the same way she had filed away the dead dashcam light the night before. Not every officer in this building was the same. That mattered. It would matter more later than either of them understood yet. At 8:15, the front door of the station opened and the bell attached to it, an old habit carried over from when the building used to be a hardware store, gave a small, cheerful jingle that did not match the mood inside at all. Opal Fenwick walked in carrying a paper bag and 2 foam cups of coffee. She had not slept much either. She had lain awake most of the night staring at her ceiling, turning over a photograph in her mind that she had not looked at directly in years. She had gotten up twice in the night, actually padding downstairs in her robe to stand in front of the register drawer where that photograph still sat, wrapped in its old dish towel. Both times she had not opened it. She had simply stood there, hand resting on the wood, before climbing back up the narrow stairs to a bed that did not feel any more restful for the visit. She told herself she was simply doing what she always did, bringing breakfast to the department the way she had for decades, a habit so old nobody in town remembered exactly when it started. She told herself that. She did not entirely believe it. "Morning, Grant," she said, setting the bag on the front counter. "Biscuits, fresh this time, not yesterday's." "You're a lifesaver, Miss Opal," Grant said, already reaching for one. Opal's eyes drifted toward the back of the station, toward the small hallway that led to the holding cell. "She's still back there?" she asked, keeping her voice light, casual, the way you ask about the weather. Grant hesitated. "Yeah. Colton wants her held till he can process everything proper. Should be released this morning, probably." "Mind if I bring her a biscuit? Poor thing didn't even finish her coffee last night." Grant glanced toward Colton's empty desk, then shrugged. "Don't see the harm." Opal picked up one of the foam cups and a biscuit wrapped in a paper napkin and walked slowly toward the back of the station, her heart beating a little faster than the short walk should have caused. Addie heard footsteps before she saw who they belonged to. She recognized the shuffle of someone older, careful with each step. The kind of walk you develop after decades on your feet in a kitchen. Opal appeared at the bars holding out a biscuit and a fresh cup of coffee like she was delivering breakfast to a regular customer instead of a stranger locked in a cell. "Figured you could use something warm," Opal said. Addie stood, took the offerings through the small opening in the bars, and managed a tired smile. "Thank you. That's kind of you." "Wasn't kind last night, letting them cart you off like that without a word," Opal said, a note of guilt creeping into her voice. "Should have said more." "You said what you could," Addie replied gently. "Sometimes that's the wisest choice available." Opal studied her for a long moment. There it was again, that flicker of familiarity she could not quite name. Something in the calm, patient way this young woman spoke, like she had all the time in the world and nothing left to prove. "You remind me of someone," Opal said slowly, almost to herself. Addie's expression did not change, but something inside her went very still. "Is that so?" she said carefully. "A man I used to know," Opal said. "Long time ago now. Wore a badge in this county, back when I still had dark hair." She let out a small, tired laugh. "Had that same way of looking at you, like he already knew the answer but wanted to give you the chance to be honest first." Addie kept her voice even. "What happened to him?" Opal's smile faded. "Nothing good," she said quietly. "Nothing good at all." For a moment, neither of them said anything. Somewhere down the hallway, a radio crackled with dispatch chatter. Grant's chair squeaked as he shifted at his desk. Opal glanced over her shoulder, checking that no one else was close enough to hear, then lowered her voice even further. "There was a sheriff here a long time back," she said. "Good man, fair man. The kind who'd give a stranded driver his last $20 and never mention it to a soul." "What happened to him?" Addie asked again, quieter this time. "There was money missing from an evidence locker. Cash seized off a man they'd arrested for running numbers out of the back of his garage. Wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to matter. Enough to make a case out of." Opal's voice had gone somewhere far away, the way voices do when they are walking back through old memory. "Somebody said the sheriff took it. Started as a whisper, then it was in a report, then it was in front of the county board, and by the time anybody thought to ask real questions, it had already hardened into fact. Somebody said he took money he shouldn't have, evidence money from a case that never should have gone missing in the first place." Opal shook her head slowly. "It wasn't true. I know it wasn't true because I saw who actually took it plain as day, right through that window there." She nodded toward the front of the diner, visible faintly through the station's own front window across the street. "Did you tell anyone?" Opal's eyes dropped to the floor. "I was young," she said. "Had 2 kids at home and a diner mortgage that kept me up nights. The men involved were the kind who could make trouble for a person who talked too much. So I stayed quiet. Told myself somebody braver than me would speak up eventually." She looked up, and for the first time her eyes were wet. "Nobody ever did," she said. "He lost his badge, lost his good name, packed up and left town inside of a month, and I never saw him again." Opal wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron, an old habit from decades of kitchen work bleeding into a moment that had nothing to do with cooking. "I think about him sometimes," she admitted. "Wonder if he ever forgave this town. Wonder if he ever forgave himself for leaving quiet instead of fighting it. Not that fighting would have done much good back then. Man like that up against the wrong people rarely wins. But I still wonder. Do you remember his name? Addie asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she was certain Opal could hear it. Opal thought for a long moment. Walter, she said finally. Walter something. Goodness, it's been so long. Walter Marsh, I believe it was. Sheriff Walter Marsh. The name hung in the cold air of the holding cell like a held breath. Addie did not move. She did not let a single flicker cross her face. But inside her chest, something 24 years old cracked open quietly the way old wounds sometimes do when you least expect them to. She had come to Millbrook chasing 4 complaint files and a pattern of quiet corruption. She had not expected to walk straight into the town that broke her father's life apart. For a moment, the whole world seemed to narrow down to the small square of gray light coming through the window near the ceiling. She thought of every family dinner where her father had gone quiet at the mention of his old career, every anniversary of a date he never explained, every time she had asked gently why he never talked about the years before her and watched him change the subject with practiced ease. She had always assumed it was simply grief. The ordinary kind, the kind that comes from leaving behind a career you loved. She had never once imagined the full shape of what he had actually lost, or how deliberately this town had helped him lose it. 24 years old, and she was only now understanding her own father for the first time. Ma'am? Opal's voice pulled her back. You all right, dear? You've gone pale. Addie forced a small, careful smile. Just tired. Long night. Opal studied her a beat longer, some instinct telling her there was more to that reaction than exhaustion, but she did not press. Well, she said, straightening up, you eat that biscuit before it goes cold, and you hang in there. This town's got more good in it than it sometimes shows. She turned to go, then paused. Funny thing, she added, almost to herself. You've got the same look in your eye he did. Like you already know the answer and you're just waiting to see if the rest of us are brave enough to catch up. She walked away down the hallway before Addie could respond. Addie sat back down on the metal bench, the biscuit forgotten in her lap, staring at nothing in particular. 20 years, she thought. 20 years her father had carried that silence like a stone in his chest, and the woman who could have helped lift it had been running a diner 300 yards from where he lost everything the whole time. She thought about calling him right then, hearing his voice, telling him she had found the missing piece he never even knew was still standing in this town. She did not. Not yet. Some truths, she had learned, need to be proven all the way through before you hand them to the people you love. A half-finished truth can hurt more than silence if it turns out to be wrong. She would not risk that, not with him, not after everything he had already lost. So she folded the ache down small, the way she had learned to do with difficult things, and she waited. Patience, her father used to say, is not the absence of feeling. It is choosing on purpose not to let feeling make your decisions for you. She held on to that now with both hands. It was not an easy thing to hold. Some part of her wanted to march straight out of this cell, straight to the diner, and demand to know every last detail Opal could remember. Another part of her wanted to call her father, immediately hear his voice, let him know that the debt he had carried alone for 20 years finally had a witness willing to speak. She did neither. She sat instead, quiet hands folded, letting the ache settle into something she could carry without it carrying her instead. That, too, was part of the job nobody warned you about in law school. Not the arguments, not the paperwork, the waiting. The discipline of sitting with a hard truth long enough to make sure you handled it correctly instead of simply handling it fast. Across town, in the small house with the peeling white paint, Walter Marsh sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had not touched. He had woken at 5, same as always, old habits from decades of early shifts refusing to loosen their grip, even in retirement. The house was quiet, in the particular way houses become quiet after children grow up and move out. He had lived alone since Addie left for law school 6 years now, and mostly he had made peace with it. He kept himself busy. He fixed things around the property that did not really need fixing. He read more than he used to. He called his daughter twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and told himself that was enough contact to keep the loneliness at bay. Most days it was. He had tried calling Addie twice already that morning. Both calls had gone straight to voicemail. That was not entirely unusual. She was often buried in casework, phone silenced, hours passing before she surfaced to check messages. But something about the silence today sat wrong with him. A low, persistent unease he could not quite explain. The kind of feeling he used to trust completely when he wore a badge and had learned the hard way never to ignore. He turned on the small radio on his kitchen counter more out of habit than expectation, tuned to the regional news station he had listened to for 30 years. Nothing about Millbrook. Nothing about anything, really. Just weather and a story about county road repairs. He told himself he was being foolish. Addie was a grown woman, a sharp one, more capable than most people twice her age. She did not need her father hovering, worrying over silence that probably meant nothing at all. He told himself that. He still could not make himself stop worrying. Around 9 that morning, his phone buzzed. Not Addie's number, a number he did not recognize with an area code from the state capital. He answered on the second ring. "This is Walter." There was a pause on the other end, then a voice careful and formal, a young staffer from the state attorney's front office reading off a call sheet. "Mr. Marsh, you're listed as an emergency contact for Adeline Marsh." Walter's hand tightened around the phone. "What's happened?" he said. Not a question, a demand, quiet and steady, the voice of a man who had delivered bad news to strangers for 22 years and had learned to brace for it in return.
"Nothing confirmed yet, sir,"
the staffer said quickly. She left an unusual voicemail on the after-hours line late last night. A case flag and a town called Millbrook. No further detail. It's a little outside her normal check-in pattern, and given the nature of that particular file, we wanted to reach out directly. Walter closed his eyes. Millbrook. Of all the towns in this state, of all the names she could have said into a phone at midnight, it had to be that one. "Thank you for calling," he said, his voice tighter than he meant it to be. "Please, if you hear anything else, anything at all." "Of course, sir. We'll be in touch." Walter set the phone down on the table with a hand that was not quite steady. He sat there for a long moment staring at nothing, the old ache in his chest waking up fully now, sharp and familiar, like a scar remembering exactly how it was made. 20 years he had stayed away from that town. 20 years he had told himself the past was the past, that dwelling on it served no one, least of all the daughter he had raised to look forward, not back. He remembered the drive out of Millbrook that final week, the truck bed loaded with boxes he had not bothered to sort, the county line sign passing by in his rearview mirror for the last time. He remembered thinking, foolishly, that leaving would be enough to close the wound. It had not been. It had simply moved the wound somewhere quieter, somewhere he could manage it without an audience. He had built a good small life after that, a life he was proud of, mostly. A daughter he loved fiercely, who had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, grown into someone who chased down exactly the kind of injustice that had once broken him. He had never told her the full weight of it. He had given her the outline, the basic facts, enough for her to understand why he left law enforcement. He had never described in detail how it felt to watch an entire town decide almost overnight that 22 years of honest service meant nothing at all. Some pain, he had decided long ago, was his alone to carry. He had not wanted it to become hers, too. He looked at his truck keys hanging on the hook by the door. Not yet, he told himself. Not until he knew more. But his hand, without quite deciding to, reached for those keys anyway and set them on the table beside his coffee, close enough to grab in a hurry. Some instincts, it turns out, never fully retire. They just wait quietly for the moment they are needed again. Back at the station, 9 o'clock came and went, and with it Deputy Wes Colton walking in 10 minutes late, sunglasses pushed up on his head despite the overcast sky, looking entirely too pleased with himself for a man who had spent the previous night behaving badly. "Morning, folks," he announced to the room like he was arriving at a party instead of a job. Grant, still at his desk, gave a small nod and said nothing. Colton grabbed a biscuit from the bag Opal had left, took a bite, and wandered toward the holding cell, chewing loudly. "Sleep well, freshman?" he asked, leaning against the bars. Addie looked up at him, calm as still water. "Well enough?" "Good, because today's the day we figure out what to do with you." He said it casually, like he had not already decided the answer hours ago. "I'd like to request a formal arraignment," Addie said. "Immediately, if possible. State law requires probable cause be reviewed by a magistrate within 24 hours of detainment, absent exigent circumstances. It has now been just over 9 hours since my arrest. I'd like that clock respected." Colton blinked. Whatever he had expected from her that morning, it was not a precise legal citation delivered in a calm, unhurried tone. "You a lawyer now, too?" he said, forcing a laugh that did not quite land. "I read," Addie said simply. Something in his expression shifted just slightly. A flicker of uncertainty he covered quickly with bravado. "We'll get to it when we get to it," he said. "Got other things on my plate this morning." "I understand you're busy," Addie said. "I'd simply like it noted formally that I made the request at 9:06 a.m. "Noted," Colton said sarcastically, already turning to walk away. He did not write it down. Grant, watching from his desk, quietly did. By late morning, word had started, in the small, invisible way word travels through a town like Millbrook, that something unusual had happened at Fenwick's the night before. Opal had not told anyone directly. She was not the type to gossip about her own diner, but somebody had noticed a patrol car parked out front with its lights flashing for a few minutes after 11. Somebody else had mentioned it to their neighbor over a fence, and that neighbor had mentioned it to the woman who cut hair 2 doors down from the diner, who mentioned it to 3 different customers over the course of the morning. By noon, half of Millbrook had heard some version of the story. Most of those versions were wrong. A few were close enough to the truth to make people uneasy. There is something worth noticing in the way a small town processes a moment like this. Nobody organizes a meeting. Nobody writes a letter to the editor, mostly because there has not been a local paper in almost a decade. Instead, the truth, or something close to it, moves quietly from kitchen table to kitchen table, porch to porch, until enough people are thinking the same uneasy thought at roughly the same time. It is slow. It is imperfect. But it is, in its own patient way, exactly how a town eventually decides what kind of place it wants to be. Colton heard the murmurs, too, secondhand, filtered through a deputy who stopped by the station for coffee around 11. It irritated him more than he wanted to admit. He did not like the feeling of being talked about. He especially did not like the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake he could not easily walk back. So he did what men like him often do when doubt starts creeping in at the edges. He doubled down. Around 1 in the afternoon, Colton walked back to Opal's diner during his lunch break, ostensibly for a sandwich, though his real purpose became clear the moment he sat down at the counter. "Heard you took a little walk over to the station this morning," he said, not quite looking at her as she poured his coffee.
Brought breakfast, same as I do every morning,
Opal said evenly. "Heard you spent extra time talking to our guest back there." Opal's hand did not shake, though something in her chest tightened. "Being neighborly. Nothing wrong with that." Colton leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, though the diner was mostly empty at that hour. "You've had that health inspection due for a while now, haven't you, Opal? Coming up sometime this spring, if I recall." Opal went very still. "I run a clean kitchen, Wes. Always have." "Sure you do," he said, an easy, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Still, inspections can turn up all sorts of little things if somebody makes a call and asks them to look real close. Grease traps, expiration dates, that sort of thing." The threat was not shouted. It was not even fully spoken. It did not need to be. Opal understood exactly what he meant. 40 years she had run this diner. 40 years of careful bookkeeping, of scrubbing every surface twice, of never once cutting a corner that might put someone's health at risk. She thought in that moment of her late husband, who had helped her open this place back when they were both younger than Addie was now, back when a loan from the bank felt like the biggest risk either of them had ever taken. She thought of the years after he passed when she had run it alone, stubborn and proud because closing it had never once felt like an option worth considering. This diner was not just a business to her. It was the one thing in her life that had never once let her down. And in less than a minute, a man half her age had just threatened to take all of it away simply because she had shown a stranger a moment of kindness. She set his coffee down without a word, walked back behind the counter and busied herself with dishes that did not need washing, her hands trembling slightly in a way she hoped he did not notice. He noticed. Men like Colton usually do. It was, in its own small, ugly way, the entire point. He finished his coffee, left exact change and no tip, and walked out whistling. That evening, back at the station, something in Adeline Marsh had quietly hardened into resolve. She had spent the day being patient, patient through the delayed arraignment, patient through Colton's careless comments, patient through hours of sitting in a cold cell while the clock toward Friday's hearing kept ticking steadily forward. But when word reached her through a nervous, apologetic Grant, who mentioned it without quite meaning to, that Colton had made some kind of veiled threat toward Opal that afternoon, patience gave way to something sharper. Not anger exactly. Addie rarely allowed herself pure anger. It clouded judgment, and clouded judgment made mistakes that careful people could not afford. What she felt instead was clarity, the particular kind of clarity that comes when a person crosses from careless into cruel, and you finally understand without any doubt left exactly what you are dealing with. "Grant," she said quietly when he came by to check on her around 6 that evening. "I need to make a formal statement, written, tonight if possible." "About what happened last night?" "About everything," Addie said. "The stop, the search of my belongings without cause, the denial of a timely arraignment, and what I understand may have happened at the diner this afternoon." Grant hesitated, glancing toward the front of the station where Colton's raised voice could be heard on a phone call about something unrelated. "That's not really my call to authorize," Grant said carefully. "It doesn't have to be authorized," Addie said. "It's my right to document my own treatment while in custody. You're welcome to witness it if you're willing." Grant studied her for a long moment. Something in her steady, unhurried voice reminded him oddly of instructors back at the academy. The good ones. The ones who taught you that the job was never really about power. It was about protecting people who could not always protect themselves. He had wanted to be that kind of officer once. Lately, working under Colton, he had started to forget what that felt like. "All right," he said finally. "Get me some paper." She wrote for almost an hour. Careful, precise, unemotional language, the kind she had been trained to use for exactly this purpose. Times, details, direct quotes as close to word for word as she could recall them. While she wrote, Grant sat nearby, not quite looking over her shoulder, but close enough to see the careful, even rows of her handwriting, so different from the rushed scrawl he had watched Colton produce the night before. "You always write like that?" he asked at one point, mostly to fill the silence. "Like it might end up in front of a judge someday?" Addie glanced up briefly. "Most things do, eventually, if you keep good enough records. People forget that until it's too late to matter." Grant thought about that for a while, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I always figured this job was mostly about showing up when something's already gone wrong," he said finally. "Didn't think much about the part where you're supposed to keep it from going wrong in the first place." "That's most of the job, actually," Addie said, not unkindly. "The part nobody puts in the recruiting posters." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. "My old training officer used to say something similar. Told me the badge doesn't make you good at the job. It just gives you the chance to be if you decide to take it." "Smart man," Addie said. "Retired 2 years ago," Grant said. "Moved out to be closer to his grandkids. I think about calling him sometimes when things get complicated around here. Haven't worked up the nerve yet." "Maybe you should," Addie said quietly. "Sounds like the kind of person worth checking in with." Grant signed as a witness, at the bottom, his signature slightly unsteady. The first real act of quiet courage he had shown in 8 months on this job. It was not much on its own, A single statement from a woman still technically in custody, witnessed by a junior deputy who could easily be dismissed as biased or confused. But Addie understood something about cases like this one, something she had learned from 3 months of studying complaint files that went nowhere. Corruption rarely falls apart because of one dramatic piece of evidence. It falls apart because enough small, honest details accumulate one on top of another until the weight of them becomes impossible to explain away. This statement was one more small, honest detail. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of her jacket, close to her body, where it would be very hard for anyone to take from her without her noticing. Colton returned to the station around 8 that evening in a worse mood than he had left in. Word had apparently reached him through channels he did not share that his morning conversation with Opal had not gone unnoticed. Perhaps someone in the diner had overheard more than he intended. Perhaps Opal herself had mentioned it to a neighbor. Small towns rarely stay quiet for long. Whatever the source, Colton walked into the station carrying the particular tension of a man who suspects for the first time that he might not be as untouchable as he had always assumed. He had spent his whole career believing that a badge worn confidently enough was its own kind of armor. Nobody in Millbrook had ever pushed back hard enough to test that belief. Not really. A few complaints, here and there, filed and quietly buried, had only reinforced the idea that he could do more or less as he pleased, so long as he stayed useful to the people who mattered. Tonight, for the first time, that armor felt thinner than it used to. He stopped by the holding cell, arms crossed, studying Addie with narrowed eyes. "You've been busy today," he said. "I've been patient," Addie replied. "There's a difference. That arraignment request of yours, Judge Whitmore's not available till Friday morning now, some scheduling issue." He said it flatly, almost daring her to challenge the excuse. Addie's expression did not change, though internally something cold settled into place. Friday morning. The exact same morning as the state oversight hearing in the Capitol, more than an hour's drive away. If her own arraignment was scheduled to overlap with that hearing, she would either miss the hearing entirely or miss the chance to be formally released from custody in time to travel. It was, she suspected, no coincidence at all. "That's an unusual scheduling conflict," she said evenly. "Small town," Colton said, shrugging with exaggerated innocence. "Things happen slower out here." "I'd like that noted as well," Addie said. "The specific timing." "Noted," Colton said, again the same sarcastic tone as that morning, and again he did not write it down. But this time, as he turned to walk away, Addie caught something in his eyes she had not seen the night before. Not just carelessness anymore. Fear, thin and poorly hidden. The particular fear of a man who has started to realize somewhere deep down that the walls he has always trusted might not hold up much longer. She had seen that particular fear before in other men in other towns. It rarely made them retreat. More often it made them grasp harder at whatever control they still had left, even when grasping only made things worse. She suspected Colton would be no different. Frightened men in Addie's professional experience rarely become more careful. They become more dangerous. That night, alone again in the cold cell, Addie sat with her back against the wall, the folded statement still tucked safely inside her jacket, and allowed herself for the first time all day a few quiet minutes to simply feel everything she had been holding back. Her father's name spoken so casually by a kind stranger over a paper cup of coffee. 20 years of silence, finally cracking open, a deputy growing more reckless by the hour, and a hearing now deliberately scheduled to collide with her own release. She thought about something her father used to tell her, back when she was a teenager, frustrated by how slowly justice sometimes moved. "The system isn't fast," he had said. "It was never built to be fast. It was built to be thorough, if the people running it actually do their jobs. Your task isn't to make it faster. Your task is to make sure it can't look away." She held on to that now, in the dark, the way you hold on to a lantern in unfamiliar woods. She thought too about Opal standing behind her counter with trembling hands, a lifetime of honest work suddenly hanging over a threat from a man not fit to carry the badge he wore. She thought about Grant, signing his name to a statement that could easily cost him his job in a department where loyalty was valued more than honesty. Neither of them had asked to be pulled into this. Neither of them owed her anything at all. And yet here they were, both of them choosing in their own small ways to stand a little straighter than the moment required. That, she thought, was the part of this job people rarely talked about. It was not really about proving one man guilty. It was about giving ordinary, decent people a reason to believe that standing up still mattered, even in a town this small, even against odds that seemed impossibly stacked. She thought about something she had come to understand slowly over years of doing this work, long before she ever set foot in Millbrook. Courage was rarely loud. It usually looked like someone quietly doing the harder, less comfortable thing simply because it was right, with nobody there to applaud them for it. Opal had done that today. So had Grant. Small, unglamorous acts, the kind that never make the evening news but hold a town together all the same. She did not know yet exactly how the next 24 hours would unfold. She knew with complete certainty that she was no longer just investigating this town. She had become part of its story now, tangled up in a debt 20 years old, one her father had carried alone for far too long. And somewhere out there past these bars, past this small, stubborn town, an old man sat by his phone with his truck keys close at hand, waiting for the call that would tell him it was finally time to come find her. Sleep came for her eventually, thin and shallow, the kind that leaves you more tired than rested but keeps you upright enough to face what comes next. She dreamed briefly of her father's porch, the 2 cups of coffee going cold between them, his voice steady and low, telling her about patience and walking straight into trouble instead of running from it. She woke once in the middle of the night to the sound of a car passing slowly outside, headlights sweeping briefly across the cell wall before moving on. For a moment, half asleep, she thought it might be him. It was not. Not yet. But somewhere, on a quiet stretch of state highway, an old man sat awake at his kitchen table, his truck waiting outside in the dark, keys resting close at hand, not yet picked up. Morning would bring the final stretch. Less than a day now stood between Addie Marsh and the hearing that could either bury the truth about Millbrook forever or finally drag it out into the light. Colton, growing more desperate by the hour, was not finished yet, not by a long way. Desperate men rarely stop on their own. They usually need someone or something to stop them, and that someone is not always who a town expects it to be. And somewhere, in a quiet farmhouse across town, an old debt was about to start walking slowly and deliberately back toward the very place it had once been buried. In Part 3, the countdown reaches its final hours. You will watch Deputy Colton make the mistake that finally exposes everything. You will learn exactly what really happened 20 years ago. And you will see at last why a young woman in a hooded sweatshirt was never someone this town should have underestimated. Stay with me for that, because sometimes the truth does not arrive quietly. Sometimes it arrives right on time, exactly when a town needs it most, wearing an old leather satchel and carrying a name this town had tried very hard to forget. Some debts take 20 years to come due. But they always do eventually, if enough patient people keep showing up one ordinary day after another, refusing to look away. There is a moment in almost every story worth telling when things look their absolute worst right before they finally turn around. You have lived long enough to know this rhythm. Life rarely hands you victory in a straight line. It usually makes you wait through one more dark hour first. Think back for a moment on your own life, the hardest chapter you ever lived through. Chances are it did not resolve itself quickly or neatly. Chances are there was a stretch right before things got better where they seemed to be getting worse instead. That is not bad luck. That is simply how real change tends to move. Slowly, then all at once. Adeline Marsh was about to live through that hour. Somewhere out on a quiet highway, an old man was already driving toward her, though she did not know it yet. And somewhere inside a small brick building on Main Street, a frightened deputy was about to make the one mistake that would finally bring everything crashing down. Let's get back to it. Friday morning arrived, gray and cold, the kind of morning that makes a person pull their coat a little tighter without quite knowing why. Addie woke before dawn, the way she often did before something important. She sat up on the metal bench, rubbed the stiffness from her neck and checked her watch. 5:41. Less than 3 hours now until the state oversight hearing began, an hour's drive away in the capital. Less than 3 hours to secure her release, gather what she could, and make it there in time. She had not slept much. Her mind had spent most of the night turning over everything she now knew. Her father's name spoken so casually by a kind stranger. A department built on quiet complaints that never went anywhere. A deputy growing more reckless with every passing hour. She thought, too, about how differently this morning felt compared to the one before it. Yesterday, she had still been gathering pieces, still uncertain how they fit together. This morning, she understood the whole shape of it. That understanding did not make her less afraid. If anything, it sharpened the fear into something more precise, more urgent. Fear, she had learned long ago, is not the enemy of good work. Recklessness is. Fear, handled carefully, simply tells you how much is truly at stake. She stood, straightened her hoodie as best she could, and waited. Patience, she reminded herself again, not the absence of urgency. Simply the refusal to let urgency make her decisions for her. Colton arrived at 6:15, earlier than his usual shift, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he had not slept well either. He walked straight to the holding cell, a folder tucked under one arm, his expression carrying a kind of tight, forced confidence that did not quite reach his eyes. "Got some news for you," he said. Addie stood watching him carefully.
I'm listening.
"Filed an additional charge overnight, obstruction of an active investigation." He said it flatly, like reading a grocery list. "Given the new charge, your release gets pushed back. Standard procedure." For a moment, Addie said nothing at all. She had expected something like this. She had not expected quite this brazen a move. "What investigation?" she said finally, her voice level. "Ongoing," Colton said. "Can't discuss details." "There is no investigation," Addie said. "You're fabricating a charge to keep me here past this morning's hearing. I'd like to see the paperwork." "Paperwork's being processed," he said, already turning to walk away. "Judge will review it whenever he gets to it. Might be tomorrow, might be Monday. Small towns, you know how it is." He said it with a small, thin smile, the smile of a man who believes, right up until the very last second, that he still holds all the power in the room. Addie watched him go, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she felt something close to real alarm settle into her chest. Not because she doubted the truth would eventually surface. She had built her entire career on trusting that eventually, given enough patience and enough evidence, truth generally found its way to daylight. She was afraid simply that eventually might not arrive in time. That somewhere in the Capitol a hearing room would fill with people this morning, wait for evidence that never showed up, and quietly close a case that had already waited 20 years too long. She thought about every complaint file she had read over the past 3 months, every one of them ending the same way. A promising start, a quiet delay, a case that simply stopped moving, one small procedural excuse at a time until nobody remembered to ask about it anymore. That was how corruption usually won, in her experience. Not through dramatic cover-ups, through delay, through exhaustion. Through people simply giving up on waiting for a system that kept finding new ways to stall. She was not going to let that happen here, not after everything it had already cost her family. She asked to see her satchel. Colton almost cheerfully informed her that her belongings had been moved to evidence storage overnight, pending review related to the new charge. Her written statement, tucked so carefully inside her jacket pocket, was gone too, along with the jacket itself, confiscated during what Colton called a routine intake correction. It was not routine. It was theft, dressed up in official language. She sat back down on the bench, hands folded in her lap, and forced herself to breathe slowly. This is what happens, she thought, when frightened men run out of patience. They stop being careful about the rules they claim to enforce. It was in its own strange way exactly the kind of mistake she had been waiting for. But mistakes only matter if somebody is there to catch them. Grant arrived for his shift at 7 and immediately sensed something had shifted overnight. Colton was pacing near the front desk, unusually animated, talking fast on the phone to someone Grant did not recognize.
Just need the release pushed to Monday, that's all I'm asking.
Yeah, obstruction. I'll have the paperwork by end of day. Grant caught only fragments, but fragments were enough. He walked past the holding cell and found Addie sitting quietly, her jacket gone, her satchel nowhere in sight. "Where's your stuff?" he asked, quietly enough that Colton would not hear.
Evidence storage, Addie said, along with a statement you witnessed last night.
Grant's stomach dropped. He understood immediately exactly what that meant. "He's trying to bury it," he said, more to himself than to her.
"He's trying to buy time,"
Addie corrected gently.
"There's a difference, and it matters. Time can still be recovered. Buried evidence usually cannot, not without someone brave enough to dig it back up."
Grant looked at her for a long moment. 8 months on this job, and he had never once felt as uncertain about what came next as he did standing in that hallway. But underneath the uncertainty, something steadier was forming too. A decision, quiet and firm, taking shape the way decisions sometimes do without much fanfare at all. "Give me a minute," he said, and walked away. He found the evidence log on Colton's own desk, left carelessly open beside a half-eaten breakfast sandwich. Addie's satchel and jacket were listed, tagged, and shelved in the small storage closet at the back of the building. The same closet Grant had access to, as much as anyone. He did not need permission to check on stored evidence. That was technically part of his job. He walked back, retrieved both items, and carried them himself to the front counter, filling out the release log properly this time, his handwriting steady despite the pounding of his own heart. He did not ask Colton first. He had learned over the past 2 days that asking permission from the wrong person is sometimes just another way of delaying the right thing. He walked the satchel and jacket back to the holding cell and handed them through the bars. "Statements still in the inside pocket," he said quietly. "Wasn't logged as separate evidence. Guess somebody forgot to check." Addie took the jacket, feeling the folded paper still tucked safely inside, and looked at him with something close to genuine gratitude.
"Thank you,"
she said simply. Grant nodded, glanced nervously toward the front of the station, and walked away before Colton noticed anything had changed. Small, quiet acts of courage rarely announce themselves. They simply happen in hallways and storage closets when nobody important is watching. But they matter enormously, all the same. Meanwhile, on the highway leading into Millbrook, Walter Marsh gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup truck, watching familiar landmarks slide past that he had spent 20 years trying not to think about. The grain silo on the edge of town, the church with the leaning steeple, the faded billboard for a lawyer 2 counties over. Nothing much had changed. That unsettled him more than change would have. He remembered, almost against his will, small, ordinary details from a life he had not let himself think about in years. The particular creak of the station's front door, the bakery on Elm Street that used to open at 5, run by a couple who had probably retired or passed on by now. The exact bend in the road where he used to slow down every morning out of habit because a farmer's dog liked to chase cars there. 20 years is a long time to stay away from a place that once felt like home. Long enough for a town to become a stranger, even while every physical detail of it remained stubbornly familiar. He had left before sunrise, unable to wait any longer, unable to sit in his quiet kitchen while some instinct deep in his gut insisted his daughter needed him. He had not called ahead. He was not entirely sure what he would say when he arrived or who exactly he would say it to. He only knew he could not stay home a moment longer. There comes a point, he thought, gripping the wheel a little tighter as the town line came into view, when an old man has to decide whether the past gets to keep dictating his choices or whether he still has enough courage left to choose for himself. He had made that decision somewhere around mile marker 40, without fully realizing he had made it at all. As he crossed the town line, an old, familiar tightness settled into his chest, the same tightness he used to feel driving these same roads on patrol decades ago, before everything fell apart. He drove straight to the one place in Millbrook he still remembered with any warmth at all: Fenwick's Diner. Opal was wiping down the front counter when the bell above the door jingled, and she looked up, expecting another ordinary customer on an ordinary Friday morning. Her hand froze mid-motion. The man standing in her doorway was older now, hair fully gray, deep lines around his eyes that had not been there before. But there was no mistaking him. For a moment, 40 years of memory rushed back at once. A younger Walter, sitting at the counter most mornings before his shift, always ordering the same thing, always leaving a tip too generous for what he could probably afford at the time. A quieter version of the same man weeks after everything fell apart, coming in one last time to say goodbye before he left town for good, unable to meet her eyes the whole visit. She had wondered over the years, in idle, quiet moments, whether he had built a good life somewhere else, whether he had forgiven this town, or himself, or her for all of it. Looking at him now standing in her doorway with the same steady bearing he had always carried, she realized she still did not know the answer to any of those questions.
Walter.
She breathed the name barely more than a whisper. He nodded, unable for a moment to find any words at all. Opal, he finally managed. It's been a long time. She came around the counter slowly, her hands trembling slightly, and for a moment neither of them moved any closer. 20 years of silence standing between them like something physical. I need to ask you something, Walter said carefully, and I need you to be honest with me, even if it's hard to hear. Ask, Opal said. Have you seen a young woman come through here? Dark blonde hair, maybe 5'5", carries an old leather bag. Opal's breath caught. She's your daughter, she said slowly. It was not quite a question. She is, Walter said. Opal, please, is she all right? Opal's eyes filled with tears, decades of guilt rising to the surface all at once. She's over at the station, Opal said, her voice breaking. Walter, I am so sorry. I should have told someone the truth 20 years ago. I should have said something, and I didn't, and now that same wickedness is happening to your girl right under my nose, and I let it happen twice. Walter reached out and gently took her hands in his, steadying them the way he used to steady frightened witnesses decades ago, back when steadying people had been part of his job. You didn't let anything happen, he said quietly. Men who abuse power are the ones responsible for that, not the people they frighten into silence. That's kind of you to say. Doesn't make it feel any less true, though. She pulled her hands back gently, wrapping her arms around herself instead. I've had 20 years to think about what I should have done differently. 20 years of Tuesday mornings, standing right behind that counter, looking out that same window, remembering. I know something about carrying a thing for 20 years, Walter said, a tired, understanding smile touching the corner of his mouth. It doesn't get lighter on its own. You have to set it down yourself eventually. Nobody else can do that part for you. I could have stopped it back then, Opal said, tears finally spilling over. I saw the whole thing, Walter. I saw who really took that money. I was standing right at that window plain as day, and I said nothing because I was scared and because I told myself somebody braver than me would speak up eventually. Did anybody? Walter asked gently. Opal shook her head. No, nobody ever did. Then maybe today is the day that changes, Walter said. Not for me. That chapter's long closed, far as I'm concerned. For her, for this town, for every person who never had anybody brave enough to stand up for them. Opal wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, took a slow, steadying breath, and nodded. There's something I never told anyone, she said. After that break-in at the hardware store, years back before it became the station, I had a camera installed outside my own place. Cheap little thing, mostly for the parking lot. It's still there, still running, faces right across the street. Walter's eyes sharpened. Does it reach the station's front lot? Enough of it, Opal said. Enough to see a patrol car parked out front 2 nights ago. Enough to see who got walked out of my diner in handcuffs and how. For the first time in 20 years, something like hope flickered across Walter Marsh's tired face. "Opal," he said carefully, "I need that footage. And I need you willing to stand behind it in front of people who matter this time." Opal squared her shoulders, an old familiar steadiness returning to her voice.
"I've spent 20 years wishing I'd been braver," she said. "Today, I intend to be."
Back at the station, the morning ticked forward with agonizing slowness. Addie sat in her cell, jacket back on, statement safely tucked inside, watching the clock on the far wall creep toward 8:30. The hearing began at 9. An hour's drive still stood between her and the Capitol, even if she were released this very moment. Colton had not returned to the cells since his early morning announcement. She could hear him at his desk, voice low and tense on another phone call. The particular tension of a man watching his careful arrangements begin to slip. Around 8:40, the front door opened and Addie heard 2 sets of footsteps enter, one steady and deliberate, one lighter and quicker. A moment later, Opal appeared at the holding cell, breathless Walter close behind her. Addie stood so fast she nearly knocked over the metal bench. "Dad!" she breathed. Walter's face crumpled with relief at the sight of her, safe, tired, but unmistakably herself. "I'm here," he said simply, closing the distance to the bars. "I'm here now." For a long moment, neither of them said anything else. Some reunions do not need many words. They only need presence. "We don't have much time," Addie said finally, forcing her voice steady. "The hearing starts at 9. "Then we'd better move fast," Walter said. Colton emerged from his office at that exact moment, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices, and stopped short at the sight of Walter Marsh standing in his station. Something in his face shifted, a flicker of recognition, though he could not quite place where from. "Can I help you?" he asked, wary. "You can start," Walter said calmly, "by releasing my daughter." "Now!" "Your daughter?" Colton repeated, glancing toward the cell, confusion flickering across his features. "Adeline Marsh," Walter said, "Assistant State Attorney, and unless you'd like to add kidnapping to whatever charges you're currently fabricating, I suggest you open that cell immediately." The name landed in the room like a dropped glass. Colton's eyes widened slightly. "Marsh," he repeated almost to himself. Something in his memory strained against a name he had heard once, long ago, in passing from older officers who rarely explained themselves fully. He remembered faintly an old story, told half-jokingly during his first week on the force, something about a sheriff who used to work this same building, disgraced and run out of town. A cautionary tale meant to remind young officers to always cover their own backs. Nobody had ever told him the man's full name. Nobody had ever mentioned a daughter. He did not have time to process it fully. Grant, watching from his desk, stood up slowly. "Colton," he said, "it's over. Let her out." Colton's eyes darted between Walter's unmoving expression, Grant's uncharacteristic firmness, and the cell where Addie stood watching him with an expression that carried no fear at all, only patient, exhausted resolve. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then something in him finally visibly cracked. He had built his entire career on the assumption that nobody in this town had the power or the courage to truly hold him accountable. Standing in that room, surrounded by 3 people who clearly did, that assumption crumbled all at once. He reached for the keys, hands shaking slightly, and unlocked the cell door. "This isn't over," he muttered, though the words carried none of their usual weight. "You're right," Addie said calmly, stepping out of the cell after more than a day and a half in custody. "It's not. It's just beginning." They made it to the Capitol with 11 minutes to spare, Walter driving faster than he had in years, hands steady on the wheel despite the speed, Opal in the back seat clutching a small hard drive like it was made of glass. The hearing room was smaller than Addie had expected, a plain space with rows of wooden chairs and a long table at the front where the State Oversight Board sat, papers organized neatly before them. She walked in, still wearing the same gray hoodie she had worn into Fenwick's diner 2 nights earlier, satchel in hand, father at her side. She looked to anyone glancing quickly, exactly like the tired college student this whole ordeal had assumed her to be. That impression lasted exactly as long as it took her to reach the front table, open her satchel, and place her identification card, badge, and prepared case file directly in front of the presiding officer.
Adeline Marsh, she said clearly.
Assistant State Attorney.
I apologize for my appearance. I've had a rather eventful few days. A quiet murmur moved through the room. The presiding hearing officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Eleanor Voss, studied the identification carefully, then looked up at Addie with new interest. Miss Marsh, she said, we were beginning to wonder if you'd make it.
So was I for a while,
Addie admitted. But I believe what I've brought with me is worth the wait. She laid it all out methodically, the way she had been trained to. The 4 prior complaints against Deputy Wes Colton quietly dismissed over 2 years. Her own detainment without adequate cause documented in careful detail. The fabricated obstruction charge filed specifically to delay her presence at this very hearing. She kept her voice level throughout, resisting the urge to let anger color her words. She had learned long ago that anger, however justified, tends to make people listen less carefully, not more. Facts laid out plainly and in order carried far more weight in a room like this one than any amount of righteous emotion ever could. The board members took notes as she spoke, occasionally exchanging glances with one another, the particular kind of glance that suggested a pattern was becoming clear to them, one complaint at a time.
Opal took the stand next, her voice steady despite decades of buried guilt finally spilling into the open. She described the footage from her small parking lot camera, later confirmed by the board's own technical staff, clearly showing an unrecorded patrol vehicle, a bag tossed carelessly to the ground, and a young woman treated with contempt before anyone in Millbrook understood who she truly was. She spoke slowly, choosing her words with the same care she might use decorating a wedding cake, each one placed deliberately, none of them wasted. Then Opal did something nobody in the room expected. She told the story of Sheriff Walter Marsh, 20 years buried, finally spoken aloud in a room full of people with the power to actually do something about it. She described the missing evidence money, the whisper that hardened into fact, the truth she had witnessed with her own eyes and stayed silent about out of fear for 2 decades.
I am done being afraid, she said, her voice breaking only slightly. This town deserves better than the silence I gave it. So does he. She turned for the first time and looked directly at Walter, sitting quietly in the front row. The whole room turned with her. Judge Voss studied Walter for a long moment. Mr. Marsh, she said carefully, would you like to address the board? Walter rose slowly. 22 years of service and 20 years of quiet grief settling into the set of his shoulders. I lost my badge in this county on a lie, he said simply. I lost more than that, if I'm honest. I lost 20 years believing this town had decided once and for all what kind of place it wanted to be. He paused, glancing at his daughter standing tall beside her satchel and her badge. I raised my daughter to believe that silence protects nobody in the end, that the only way forward is standing quietly in the wrong place at the wrong time and refusing to look away. His voice caught slightly. I did not know 3 months ago that she had chosen this particular town to prove that belief true. I only know that I am proud of her more than words can properly say. He sat back down, and for a long moment the room stayed completely silent, the kind of silence that carries more weight than any applause ever could. The board deliberated for less than 20 minutes. Deputy Wes Colton was suspended immediately, pending a full criminal investigation into charges of abuse of power, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. The 4 previously dismissed complaints were reopened, along with a formal review of every arrest he had made over the past 2 years. Millbrook's police department itself was placed under state supervision pending a complete audit of its practices, its record-keeping, and the culture that had allowed one deputy's misconduct to go unchecked for so long. The fabricated obstruction charge against Addie herself was dismissed within the hour, along with every charge stemming from that first night at the diner. Judge Whitmore's office issued the dismissal without comment, though Addie suspected the silence said more than any statement could have. Judge Voss, before adjourning the hearing, paused
and looked directly at Walter, still seated quietly in the front row.
Mr. Marsh,
She said, "On behalf of this board, I want to formally note that your record effective today is fully cleared. 20 years is far too long for an honest man to wait for that sentence to be spoken. I am sorry it took this long."
Walter simply nodded, throat too tight for words, one hand finding his daughter's shoulder beside him and holding on. Opal, sitting just behind them, pressed a hand over her mouth, tears falling freely now. Decades of silence, finally, formally forgiven by the one thing that mattered most. Not by a courtroom, by herself, finally willing to believe she deserved it. It was not, Addie knew, a perfect ending. Real justice rarely arrives perfectly or all at once. There would be more hearings, more paperwork, months, possibly years of careful, unglamorous work still ahead. Colton's criminal trial alone would likely take the better part of a year to work through the courts. The department audit would take longer still, uncovering no doubt other small failures alongside the large ones already exposed. Grant would need to testify multiple times, his own career forever marked, for better or worse, by the choices he had made this week. None of that would be simple. None of it would happen quickly. But for the first time in 20 years, the record finally, formally reflected the truth. Sheriff Walter Marsh had never taken a single dollar that was not his. They drove back to Millbrook together that afternoon, Walter behind the wheel, Addie beside him, both of them quiet for most of the ride. The kind of comfortable quiet that only exists between people who trust each other completely.
"You could have told me you were coming here," Walter said eventually. "I'd have driven you myself." "I know," Addie said, "but you needed to stay away from this place a little longer, just until I knew for certain it was worth bringing you back to." Walter glanced at her, something soft in his expression. "And is it worth it?" Addie thought about Opal standing tall in that hearing room after 20 years of silence, about Grant quietly returning a jacket and a statement risking his own career to do the right thing, about a town that had, in the end, chosen to catch up to the truth even if it took far too long to get there. "Yes," she said finally, "I think it is." They stopped at Fenwick's Diner on the way back into town, the neon sign buzzing warmly against the late afternoon sky. Opal met them at the door apron, still on, eyes still a little red from the hearing, but her whole posture somehow lighter than it had been in years. "Coffee's on the house," she said, ushering them inside. "Both of you, for as long as you're in town." They sat in the same back booth where this had all begun 2 nights and a lifetime ago. Opal brought coffee, and this time nobody let it go cold. Word had already begun spreading through Millbrook by early afternoon, the same quiet, invisible way it always did, kitchen table to kitchen table, porch to porch. A few regulars drifted in over the next hour, unusually talkative, unusually curious, several of them stopping by the back booth just long enough to shake Walter's hand or offer a quiet word of apology on behalf of a town that had let him down so badly, so long ago. Walter accepted each one graciously, though Addie could see in the tired set of his shoulders how much effort each small exchange cost him. Forgiveness, she was learning, is rarely a single moment. It is closer to a long series of small moments repeated patiently until the weight of the old wound finally starts to lighten. "I never got the chance to properly thank you," Walter said quietly once the diner had quieted again, "for finally saying what needed saying." Opal reached over and squeezed his hand briefly. "I should have said it 20 years ago, Walter. I'm only sorry it took me this long." "You said it when it mattered most," Walter said gently. "That counts for something. That counts for a great deal, actually." They sat together for another hour, the three of them talking quietly about small, ordinary things. Opal's grandchildren, grown now, scattered across 3 different states. Walter's garden and the tomatoes he was fairly certain would fail again this year, same as every year before it. Addie's work, described in careful general terms that left out most of the difficult parts. It was, Addie thought, watching her father laugh softly at something Opal said, one of the most ordinary afternoons she could remember
in a very long time.
Sometimes, after everything hard finally resolves itself, what you need most is not celebration. It is simply an ordinary afternoon shared with people who matter, coffee going warm instead of cold for once. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over Millbrook, Addie stepped outside the diner alone for a moment, leather satchel slung over one shoulder, the same one that had been tossed carelessly to the ground just 2 nights before. She thought about how strange it was the way a single ordinary object could carry so much meaning by the end of a story like this one. A bag, once treated like garbage, now holding the very evidence that had helped restore a family's name. Objects do not change. People's understanding of them does. She thought that was probably true of people too, in the end. Nobody in this town had truly known who she was sitting alone in that diner booth 2 nights ago. They had seen a hoodie, a laptop, a tired young face, and decided, without asking a single real question, that they already understood everything worth knowing. It had taken patience and pain and one very old debt finally coming due to prove them wrong. Grant found her there a few minutes later, still in uniform, looking somehow both exhausted and lighter than she had seen him look in 2 days. "Figured I'd catch you before you headed out," he said. "I owe you a great deal," Batty said. "More than a simple thank you can cover." Grant shrugged, a little embarrassed. "Just did what felt right. Wish I'd done it sooner, honestly. Wish I'd said something the very first night." "You did it when it mattered," Addie said, echoing what Walter had told Opal only hours earlier. "That's rarely as simple as it sounds, especially in a place like this." Grant nodded, glancing back toward the station down the street, its lights still on, an investigation now quietly beginning inside that would take months to fully unfold. "Think this town's gonna be all right?" he asked. Addie considered the question carefully before answering. "I think it's going to have the chance to be," she said. "Whether it takes that chance is up to everyone still standing in it." That night, driving home beside her father, the truck's headlights cutting through the deepening dark, Addie finally let herself feel the full weight of everything the past 2 days had carried. The fear she had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge, the grief, decades old, finally given room to breathe. The quiet, stubborn hope that had carried her through a jail cell, a fabricated charge, and a town that had almost let the truth slip away for good. She watched the dark shapes of familiar countryside slide past the window, the same highway her father had driven that morning in the opposite direction, and thought about how strange it was that a single road could carry so much history in both directions at once. "You all right?" Walter asked, glancing over at her. "I will be," Addie said honestly. "Give me a few days." Walter reached over and squeezed her hand briefly, the way he used to when she was small and frightened of thunderstorms. "Take all the time you need," he said. "You've more than earned it." They drove in comfortable silence for a while after that, the radio playing low, some old song neither of them bothered to name. "I used to wonder," Addie said eventually, "why you never talked about it much. Millbrook, I mean, the whole thing." Walter was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Some things feel too heavy to hand to the people you love. I didn't want you carrying my grief on top of your own life. Seemed unfair to ask that of you." "I ended up carrying it anyway," Addie said gently, "just without knowing what it was I was carrying." Walter glanced at her, something soft and a little sad in his expression. "I'm sorry for that. I thought silence was protecting you. Turns out it mostly just left you guessing." "Well," Addie said, managing a tired smile, "I suppose we've both learned something about the cost of silence this week." Walter laughed quietly, the sound rough but genuine, the first real laugh Addie had heard from him in days. "Suppose we have," he agreed. 3 weeks later, Addie drove back out to Millbrook one more time, alone, this time on official business that had slowly become something closer to personal. The department audit was well underway. Grant, promoted temporarily to acting deputy in Colton's absence, met her at the station with a stack of records neatly organized, exactly the kind of thorough, careful work she had come to expect from him. Judge Voss's office called yesterday, he told her, handing over a folder. Said to tell you the criminal case against Colton is moving forward. Full trial probably by fall. Good, Addie said simply. For what it's worth, Grant added, a little awkwardly, I've been thinking about applying to the academy again. Proper training this time. Maybe transfer somewhere with better oversight once all this settles.
Addie studied him for a moment. This town could use someone like you staying honestly. Departments don't fix themselves by losing the people who actually care about doing it right. Grant considered that, nodding slowly. Maybe I'll think on it a while longer. Addie hoped he would stay, at least for now. Departments needed people like him far more than they needed people who simply followed orders without asking whether those orders were right. Before she left, she stopped by Fenwick's diner, drawn there almost without deciding to be. Opal spotted her through the window and waved her in before she had even reached the door. The diner looked the same as always, except for one small addition. A modest handwritten sign now hung near the register, simple black letters on white cardstock. This establishment believes in second chances and in telling the truth, even when it's hard.
New policy? Addie asked, smiling.
New reminder, Opal said. For myself, mostly. Figured I'd earned the right to put it somewhere I'd see it every single day. They talked for a while, easy and unhurried, the way old friends talk, though they had known each other barely a month. Some relationships, Addie was learning, do not need years to become real.
They only need one honest, difficult moment shared fully to skip straight past the small talk most friendships take months to move beyond.
Before she left, Opal pressed a small paper bag into her hands. Inside, warm and fresh, sat 2 biscuits, wrapped carefully in a napkin. One for you, Opal said. One for your father. Tell him he's welcome back here any time he likes.
Coffee's always on the house for the Marsh family, far as I'm concerned. Forever, if I have any say in it.
Addie hugged her tightly before leaving, something she had not planned on doing, something that simply felt necessary in the moment. Driving out of Millbrook that afternoon, she glanced once in her rearview mirror at the fading shape of the town behind her. 3 months ago, this had been nothing more than a name on a case file, 4 dismissed complaints, and a pattern she suspected but could not yet prove. Now it was a place that held pieces of her own family's history, finally set right. A woman who had found her courage 20 years too late and used it anyway. A young deputy, learning slowly what kind of officer he still had time to become.
Change rarely finishes all at once. It simply starts quietly in one honest moment and keeps moving forward from there, one ordinary day at a time.
Addie thought about that idea the whole drive home, watching the grain silo and the leaning church steeple fade into her rearview mirror one final time that day. Millbrook was not fixed, not entirely.
Towns rarely are not in any way that wraps up neatly.
But it was trying now, openly, in ways it had not tried in 20 years. Sometimes that is the most any of us can ask of a place or a person. Not perfection, just an honest attempt finally made in daylight instead of buried in silence. If you have made it this far with us, you already understand something important about this story.
It was never really about a badge, or a diner, or even a single deputy who mistook cruelty for strength. It was about what happens when ordinary people, frightened and imperfect as they are, finally choose courage over comfort. An old woman who carried guilt for 20 years and finally set it down. A young deputy who returned a jacket instead of looking away. A father who drove toward danger instead of waiting safely at home. A daughter who chose patience over anger and let the truth prove itself one careful detail at a time. None of them were extraordinary people, not in the way movies usually tell it. They were simply willing, when the moment finally came, to stop staying quiet. Maybe you know someone like Opal, someone who has carried an old regret for years, quietly, never quite finding the right moment to set it down. Maybe you are that person yourself, holding on to a silence you have always meant to break. If this story tells you anything, let it be this: it is never too late to speak the truth you have been carrying. 20 years passed before Opal Fenwick found her courage.
The town needed her to find it anyway, whenever it finally came. Yours might be needed too, sooner than you think. That is really all courage ever asks of any of us. Not perfection, not fearlessness. Just one honest moment when silence would have been so much easier, and we choose to speak anyway. Think for a moment about the people who shaped you. A parent who worked quietly and never once complained. A neighbor who showed up during your hardest season without being asked. A friend who told you a hard truth because they loved you too much to stay silent. None of them likely thought of themselves as brave. They simply did the next right thing, and then the one after that, and somehow added together it became a life worth admiring. That is the kind of courage this story was really about, not the dramatic kind, the daily kind. The kind available to every single one of us, regardless of age, regardless of how tired we might feel some mornings. Sheriff Walter Marsh got his name back that Friday afternoon, 20 years later than it should have taken. His daughter got something else entirely. Proof carried home in an old leather satchel that the world can still be set right even when it takes far longer than anyone would like. And Millbrook slowly, imperfectly began the long work of becoming the kind of town it always could have been if enough people had simply found the courage to speak a little sooner. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own quiet moments of courage or the people in your life who taught you what patience really means, we would love for you to share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you believe, as we do, that dignity is worth defending no matter how long it takes to restore it, we will see you in the next story. Take care of each other out there. Call the person you have been meaning to call. Say the thing you have been meaning to say. 20 years is a long time to wait. And remember, the quietest person in the room is sometimes carrying the loudest truth of all.